Today, we continue the discussion on PGT, A, NM, NSR, as well as PGS and CCS. I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday. Let's start by summarizing the last podcast, part 1. In the first podcast, we talked about what PGS, PGD, PGT, CCS is. We specifically talked about when biopsies are performed. We talked about issues with day 3 and day 5 biopsies. Now, again, the reason why we do PGS is to have better pregnancy rates. PGS is to improve pregnancy rates, whereas PGD is there to find things that are wrong that we know about, and we'll talk more about that today. Now, when it comes to biopsies, we talked about day 3 biopsies are harmful to the embryo, whereas day 5 biopsies have been shown not to be harmful to the embryo. Again, we discussed last week that you still have to be able to biopsy the embryo and you can still hurt it, but generally, if done well, day 5 biopsies have less harm to the embryo compared to a day 3 biopsy. And we also talked last week about when biopsies can be performed. We talked about biopsies being performed at the polar body. We talked about on day 3 when there's 8 cells, and we even talked about on day 5. And if you remember, no one really does polar biopsies other than if you're in countries that don't allow biopsies. Most people will do a biopsy on day 5. There are still a few people who do day 3 biopsies, which has been shown to be of lower quality, more harmful to the embryo, and could lead to more errors since you are taking only one cell and multiplying the DNA from that single cell, which means if something's missing, you won't see it because you're just amplifying the same cell. But even more so, you have nothing to compare it to. Whereas in a day 5 biopsy, you have multiple cells, multiple pieces of DNA, where you can then determine if there is mosaicism or if all of the cells agree that they're normal or abnormal. Now, before we get into the controversies of PGS embryos and if we're throwing away abnormal embryos, I want to take a minute to talk about PGD, which makes it so unique. See, in PGD, which is now called PGT-M, we're looking for a specific disorder. But the problem here is that when you don't find something, it doesn't mean that you don't have it. Because you can't assume that the testing you did would have found it. So, for example, let's say you're looking for a cystic fibrosis abnormality. And you look through all the DNA from the biopsy, and it's not there. It's easy to say, okay, they don't have that, right? But if you remember in the first podcast, I mentioned you're taking cells, and what you're doing is you're amplifying the cells to then have more DNA to work with. But the problem is, if you didn't amplify the area that was abnormal, you won't find the problem. So you can't just do that like you do with PGTA or PGS. Instead, you have to make a probe. And this probe doesn't just look for the abnormal gene. It actually looks for the DNA around the abnormal gene. This way, if the DNA is missing, for example, the cystic fibrosis abnormal gene, you won't just say the patient doesn't have that. You have to make sure that also the normal DNA, which doesn't have the cystic fibrosis gene, is there. Then you can confirm that this baby actually doesn't have that disease. But by just saying the cystic fibrosis gene is not there, you can't say the baby doesn't have that disease because it could just be amplification that didn't occur. This is different than PGS, also called PGTA, because There we're looking at large chromosomal problems. So even if something doesn't amplify, the portion next to it will, and we'll be able to know if there's incorrect copy numbers of chromosomes, such as trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome, or missing a chromosome like in Turner syndrome. So now we go off the PGS. And based off of everything I said, now it sounds like PGS is perfect, right? I mean, everyone should do it. It will improve your chances. Well, not exactly. PGS, PGTA, only helps you find the normal embryos, so you put those back first. Now, understand that if an embryo is abnormal, it doesn't matter if it has a good grade. So, example, if we're grading embryos with A, B, C, you still won't get pregnant or you're going to have a miscarriage. So what PGS does is allow you then to find which embryos are normal from the beginning, so you don't have to waste time putting back embryos that may not get you pregnant. Now, if you're young, let's say like 25, there's such a high ratio of normal embryos that you're probably not going to find the benefit of PGS. However, when you're more mature and you have fewer embryos that are normal, then PGS will become helpful because now it can help determine the best embryo to put back. When we are determining which embryos to transfer, we use a lot of things. First, we look at the grade. Now, when you think of grade, there are many grading systems. So I'm just going to give you a generic one. We'll call it ABC. Even our clinic, we don't use that grading system, but a lot use that. A lot use one called good, fair, poor. But let's just use this for the example. If you are looking at embryos and grading them by the ABC grading system, then as you expect, your A's would have a better chance at getting you pregnant than the B's than the C's. Now, why is this? Is it just because good-looking embryos get to have all the fun? Well, no. What it is that the embryos that are A are more likely to be normal. And the embryos that are graded B are less likely than A's, and embryos that are C are less likely than B's. So it's not that the grading is making the embryos better. It's just that there's a likelihood that the embryos that have the better grades are genetically normal and will lead to a higher pregnancy rate per transfer. So when you do PGS, now you know the embryo is normal. So you would assume then that the ABC grading system doesn't matter. And in some ways, it doesn't. Now, is there a difference between the highest graded embryo and the lowest graded embryo that you would transfer? There is, but it's very small. Nothing like you would see with an ABC method without PGS. So PGS lets you know which embryos are the best without relying on a system that doesn't work that well. PGS isn't perfect, but I've never met anyone who has ever regretted doing PGS. Most patients are happy they did it because they know they have the best chance with that transfer. I think it helps even when you don't get pregnant, because if you don't get pregnant, at least you know it wasn't because the embryo was abnormal. And it allows you then to look at other causes of the transfer not working. Whereas if you don't know the PGS results, then most likely what your doctor is going to say to you is, oh, the embryo is probably abnormal. And that doesn't help because now you don't look at other causes. So personally, I think PGS is always worthwhile, even in young people. And it's been shown that in young people, there probably isn't much of a benefit. But the question is, if it was free, would we not do it? Well, the reason why most people don't recommend it for younger people is because it's not free. And it costs a lot of money at most clinics. Now, at our clinic, we do it very affordable. That's why many people do it. But I can agree if it's a very high expense at your clinic and you are young, under 30, there probably is not the best benefit of using PGS because you may not need it. So other than cost, what's other reasons to not do PGS? Well, one concern people have is maybe we're hurting the embryo. Well, we talked about this earlier. It's been shown on day 5 biopsies, it does not hurt the embryos. We do not see a lower success rate with those embryos because of the biopsy like we did with day 3. Now, when it comes to things like, well, what about fetal anomalies? Is there a higher chance of that by doing the biopsy? The answer is no. We find that is not higher than just doing IVF alone. Now, when it comes to short-term neonatal outcomes, we find that PGT does not appear to be associated with any increased risk of any fetal growth restriction, low birth weights in single or twin pregnancies. So again, no short-term issues. But what about long-term issues? Well, we haven't been doing PGT long enough to have lots of data, but right now for children up to 5 to 6 years old exposed to PGT, we have not noticed any problems and have had similar cognitive and psychomotor development outcomes as children not exposed to PGT who have conceived naturally. So it seems to be pretty safe. And as we talked about earlier, we're not biopsying the baby, so we don't have to worry about biopsying a leg. We're biopsying the placenta. So one of the great things about biopsying the placenta cells, the trophectoderm, is that the baby isn't there. But one of the downsides of doing that is that we're actually not getting the exact cells from the baby, but we're getting the same progenitor cells that started to make the baby. Now, anything that happens after they become placenta and baby cells would not show up in the baby, but would show up in the placenta. So what I'm talking about is post-fertilization mitotic errors. These are errors that happen after the cells have divided, so where some cells become the baby, some cells become the placenta, and then those cells have problems. And that's what leads then to mosaic cell lines. And we know already that 1% to 2% of CVS samples, which is chorionic villus sampling, it's kind of like an amniocentesis, but of the placenta, has been shown to have mosaic cell lines. And so although it's a great thing that we're testing the trophectoderm to not hurt the baby, we also may not be getting all of the information. Now, there are some doctors out there who will grab a soccer ball and say that an embryo is like a soccer ball, and when you look at the black and white parts of a soccer ball, when you're taking a biopsy, you might only be taking the black ones and not the white ones, and that's the reason you won't have all the information. Now, this sounds great. It's a great example, and I kudos to the person who started this, Dr. Paulson, but it's not that simple. Cells aren't like that. There's many more cells. It's more complicated than that. And when we take biopsies, we're taking biopsies of multiple cell lines. And so, yes, it's true that when you take a biopsy, we can't say with 100% certainty that the cells elsewhere on the trophectoderm can't be different than the cells we biopsied. So if you were only taking 1 or 2 cells, I think that concept holds a lot of water. But if you're taking 4 to 5 cells, up to 6 cells, you're getting enough sample that you should be representing the embryo well. Now, again, there's no way to know 100% if those cells represent the baby, but it would be very unlikely for the cells to be completely different between the trophectoderm and the baby, but it is possible. So what is all this concern then with throwing away abnormal embryos? I mean, you can find tons of things online now that talk about all these instances where people have had abnormal embryos and put them back and have healthy babies. The important part here is to understand that that is not the PGT that we're doing today. See, in the past, when we did day 3 biopsies, we were only taking that 1 cell. We couldn't even see what's called mosaicism, when there are more than 1 cell line there. And so today we do day 5 biopsies. So when you hear about a lot of these cases, a lot of times they're day 3 biopsies. Now, the second thing about this is that the technology they used back then didn't have the ability to see mosaicism as well as we can now. Even if they were doing the day 5 biopsy, it didn't have the ability like next-gen sequencing. So, yes, if an embryo was mistakenly being called abnormal, when really it was mosaic, then that embryo put back at a later time will be normal. And the same thing if the embryo was called normal, when really there were some mosaic cells, it's possible it would have not had as good as a pregnancy rate. And so it's important to understand that you cannot compare these two things. The example I use, although not my best example, is the Roomba robot that cleans up your floor. When this came out, everyone thought, oh, this is awesome. And they bought one and they got it and they realized it sucked. The thing was horrible. It didn't clean very well. You had to plug it in. It couldn't really map your room. And so it was horrible. Then they came out with a second edition. It got a little bit better. Eventually it was able to plug itself in, but it wasn't great. But now the robot can clean well. It can map your room. It can even plug itself in. So if someone said to me, hey, I don't think you should buy a Roomba robot because I got one 10 years ago and it was really bad. Well, I'd be like, well, yeah, but that was 10 years ago. It's kind of old technology. Don't you think it's a little better now? It was old in the past. I didn't like it. Not going to try it now. Well, that's just being dumb. And that's kind of how it is with this PGS thing is that, yes, no one is going to disagree that there were problems in the past. No one's going to disagree that abnormal embryos were thrown away. But that's not what we're using today. And so that argument doesn't work. And so I can tell you that, at least at our clinic, using next-gen sequencing and looking at mosaic embryos, the chances that you are throwing away an abnormal embryo is now extremely low. It's not zero, because that means the test would have to be perfect. And that means we'd have to get cells that represent the baby 100% of the time, and that's not possible. But it is much, much lower than it was in the past. So does this mean then that if your clinic does PGS using next-gen sequencing and does day 5 biopsies, that you are safe to move forward and never have to worry about throwing away abnormal embryos? The answer is simple. No, you still need to be worried. Now, why? Because just because they can see mosaic doesn't mean they want to. There are some clinics who choose to not report mosaic. Now, I can't condemn them for that. That's their choice. But if you are worried about this, and there is a group of women who should be, which we will talk about, you need to ask your clinic, do you report mosaics? And if they don't, the next question you have to ask is, if you don't, can I find out their mosaic if my embryos come back abnormal? So why would someone not want to report mosaic embryos? Because the chances of pregnancy are lower. It will hurt their rates. There's no question about it. So what's a mosaic embryo? It's an embryo that has more than one cell line. So it means it has both normal cells and it has abnormal cells. That means it has 3 possible states. The first state is it's actually a normal embryo. And in that situation, it should work and no problems. The second state it could be is that the embryo could actually be abnormal, having the genetic issue that shows up the mosaic. So example is it may have normal cells and then have trisomy 13. The third state is actually having mosaic cells, meaning it's not that some of the cells were wrong and it's really normal and that those cells were just some abnormal cells left behind that were undergoing a process called atresia, which are dying. But in reality, both cell lines live in the embryo. And those embryos themselves do have a lower chance of pregnancy. So when you put back a mosaic embryo, one of the things you have to find out is what is the abnormality of the embryo? So for example, if it was trisomy 21 mosaic, you have to understand that yes, that embryo could be normal, but it could also be abnormal and that those normal cells are seeing are actually left over and that the embryo is really abnormal and that you could potentially have a child with trisomy 21. The same thing, it could be mosaic where the penetrance, which means the amount of the disease that would show up in the baby, will be variable due to the mosaicism. So mosaic embryos are very important. And most of the time, people have other embryos to use and they don't use those embryos. But if you're more mature and you have fewer embryos and that's your only embryo left, then you need to speak to your doctor, a genetic counselor, and make the decision if that embryo you feel comfortable with placing it back. I personally would never put back an abnormal embryo based off the current technology. Now, mosaic embryos are different. In that situation, I think it is very reasonable. And when I talked about patients who this should matter most to, it's women who have fewer embryos. If you are more mature, let's say you're 42 and you're only able to get one embryo each time, and all you ever get back is a mosaic embryo, then it's worth putting back that embryo because that is all you have. Even though the chances may be lower, it's worth it. However, if you're younger and let's say you can get embryos at any time because you have good ovarian reserve, and for some weird reason you get a bunch of abnormal mosaic embryos, it may be worth going through again to get more embryos because you can, but not everyone has that benefit. And sometimes some people work very hard to finally get an embryo, and when it comes back mosaic, they should have the choice to put it back. Hopefully this discussion has helped you understand PGS, understand its limitations, understand where we are today, and understand the benefits of PGS and if it's right for you. Personally, as I said, at our clinic where we make it extremely affordable, I highly recommend PGS. Almost every patient who does in PGS at some point comes back wishing they did. Maybe it's because they had a boy and now they want a girl. Maybe it's because of the fact that they had a failed transfer and now they wish they would have just done the PGS to improve their chances. For whatever reason, I think you have to look at your situation and make sure it's good for you. And if you are someone who's younger, it may not help you as much. If you're someone who's more mature, it's going to benefit you more. Additionally, if you are more mature and you have few embryos that you can get, or it's very difficult for you to get embryos, it is really important to make sure the clinic you use divulges that they have mosaic embryos. So how big is the difference between using PGS and not PGS per transfer? Well, let's use single embryo transfers as a start. For someone who is under 35, using a good clinic or even a great clinic, your chances with one embryo are approximately 40 to 50%. Now, that doesn't even include live birth rate. That's pregnancy rate. You would expect about a 10% chance of miscarriage based off of age. But if you're 42 years of age, there is only a 16% chance that embryo will even be genetically normal. The chances of having success are about 10 to 20% with that single embryo. And again, that's pregnancy rate, not live birth rate. The live birth rate is going to be much lower because at 42, now your miscarriage rate can be as high as 25%. And so your live birth rate will be much lower. But with a PGS normal embryo, it is not uncommon from even okay clinics and great clinics to have anywhere between a 60-70% chance of pregnancy and usually at least a 60% chance of live birth rate. Whereas at 42, with one PGS normal embryo, your chances are also close to 60%. So as you can see, there is always a small benefit. But for people who are more mature, there is even a bigger benefit. Now, I'll even go a step further. I would even make the argument that the people who are worried that they are throwing away abnormal embryos would benefit doing PGS. And what I would say is just don't throw away those embryos. Keep the abnormal ones. I don't care. But here's why it will help you. Because when you are more mature, commonly you don't make as many eggs. Commonly you struggle to make embryos. And the one thing you don't have is time. Your fertility is dropping rapidly. And so if you have a low AMH, if you have a low antral follicle count, if you are more mature, then even if you get pregnant, and then them having a miscarriage, you could be waiting 4 to 6 months until you can do another IVF cycle. But if you're doing PGS, at least you'll know when you finally get a normal embryo. And you won't waste time doing transfers that can lead to miscarriages and could lead to you missing your window of opportunity for IVF because your fertility rate drops too low due to miscarriages. So I personally feel it's always useful to do PGS, even if you want to keep the abnormal embryos, to at least let you know when you have a normal embryo and when you can stop going after embryos to get that normal one. Again, it would also limit the time that you would lose to having miscarriages. So that then brings us to the next question. Does it actually prevent miscarriages? Now, this has been debated. Now, at our clinic and other clinics, they have noted a lower miscarriage rate, and that's expected because if you're more mature and you have a higher miscarriage rate, you're going to see a difference using PGS embryos. Now, younger people are not going to see as big of a difference because if your miscarriage rate is 10% and PGS drops it down to 5%, it's very hard to see a 5% discrepancy. But where PGT really comes into play is when we're looking at PGT-SR. With PGT-SR, where there's a rearrangement of the DNA, there is absolutely a benefit to using PGT-SR versus not doing it. And now your miscarriage rate can drop from 26 to 64% with a translocation all the way down to 5 to 15%. Hopefully the information I presented to you will help you make a decision that's best for you. And again, it's always important to talk to your doctor and make a plan with them. We now take a look in the mailbag. So the first question I was asked was, does PGS prevent all chromosomal problems? And the simple answer is no, it does not. PGS, PGTA only looks at copy numbers of the chromosomes. And so it's looking for things like extra chromosomes, looking for lower number of chromosomes, abnormal chromosomes, such as in the wrong places. What it doesn't do is it doesn't look down at the level of genes. It also can have difficulty looking at copy numbers. So if, let's say, all the chromosomes have multiplied by 3 and it's an XX chromosome being female, it may not pick that up if you're using next-gen sequencing or CGH. Versus if you're using SNP would find that. The other thing it can't detect are very, very small microdeletions. Most PGS companies are around 10 to 20 megabit. But when you're looking at these deletions that are maybe 1-2 megabits, there is no way for the current studies to detect that without using something like PGD. And the only way you can use PGD, which is now called PGTM, is if you know the problem's there. And the problem is most of those microdeletions are not known. They occur spontaneously. Even if PGS shows that the embryo does not have Down syndrome, it does not mean it's perfect. And therefore, every patient who undergoes PGS, PGT needs to undergo further testing during pregnancy. The second question I was asked was, what does MitoSure do? And how is that used in selecting which embryos to transfer? And this is a great question because mitochondria actually have different DNA than our cells. And so the mitochondrial DNA can be looked at separately. And one of the things that they have looked at is that when embryos are stressed, there is differences in the amount of mitochondrial DNA present. The thought is if an embryo is extremely stressed, it will have to make more. And in that situation, the embryo will have less potential to implant. So the question came up, could we use the mitochondrial biogenesis markers to determine if they can implant better? Now, this test, although there has been some correlations showing that mito scores can be associated with implantation, it is not a strong correlation. And for this reason, MitoSure testing should be used in conjunction with normal parameters used to determine which embryos to transfer. So for example, when we're looking at which embryos to transfer, we first look at, is the embryo normal or abnormal? So we have PGS testing, that trumps everything. The second thing we look at is then we look at the phenotype. Now, that's interesting because earlier in this podcast, I said, if you do PGS, the phenotype, meaning the grading A, B, C, doesn't matter as much. And that's still true. But there are still times that even with normal embryos, the A's do still do a little better than the B's and the C's. So we use that as the next determination. The other things we look at are things like, what day was the embryo biopsied on? Was it biopsied on day 5? Was it biopsied on day 7? That makes a difference because embryos that take longer sometimes can have lower implantation. And then the very last thing that we would use would be the mito score. So if someone had 2 embryos exactly the same, biopsy exactly the same, phenotype exactly the same, then we would put back the embryo with the lower mito score. Thanks again for another great week. Hopefully everyone learned something and will help them make decisions. As always, I greatly appreciate everyone who reviews us and everyone who rates us, which helps us get known. I always love the questions, and if you have questions after today's episode, please ask them, and I will be more than happy to answer them in following episodes. Email us at tbft@newdirectionfertility.com. I wish everyone a great week. Until next week, this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesdays.